Good morning, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we're speaking with Alan Lim. He's a director at Alton Aviation Consultancy. I always got to remember to put in the consultancy part. Alan, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Matt, for having me. It's great to be here today.
We've had some of your, as I was talking to you earlier, we've had some of your colleagues on the show previously, but tell us a little bit about Alton, the kind of consulting you do. Your company covers pretty much the entire aviation universe.
That's right. So Alton Aviation, we are a boutique management consultancy firm focused solely, on the aviation space. So we cover the traditional sectors of aviation, your airlines, your airports, MROs, business aviation providers. But we also cover sort of the new aviation in our tech and mobility practice, with which I'm co-lead of that practice at the firm. For us at Alton, we work very closely, not only with some of these operators we've mentioned, but we also work closely with investors, financial institutions on various investments, various transactions. We work on projects ranging from due diligences, market assessments, forecasting, strategic business planning, among many other projects.
Okay, great. I think you were one of the authors of this report that was issued recently, a new white paper on the growth of aviation in Asia. You and your co-authors talked about China and India being the twin engines of growth. Let's talk about that, and also where does Southeast Asia fit into that equation? I think you mentioned in the report that Indonesia was sort of slowing things down, and China actually hasn't really come back full. Is that right?
That's correct. I think, when we look at, starting with sort of the twin engines of growth that you mentioned, right? Definitely China and India, we cannot ignore them. I think taken together, they contribute to more than a third of the world's population. I think something like 2.8 billion this year. And if we look at, air traffic demand, China in particular contributes about a quarter of the total international traffic and about a tenth of total global domestic traffic. So when we think about these two countries, China is sort of the big market in the world today. But what it's facing issues of a declining population, a slowing economy, while India, on the other hand, is sort of facing fortunes that goes the other way. So, while the fact remains that, China is a market that we can't ignore, India is a market, while it's fast growing, it's still, a little much smaller compared to China. So, it is definitely one to watch. Its growth story is one to watch in the future. I think there's something like 2,000 aircraft that have been placed on order by different airlines in India over the coming years to cater to this demand. So, therefore, I think India is not a market that we can ignore. While China, given the current size, even though the trajectory is sort of flattening a little bit, it's something that, will still remain important, when we talk about their contributions to air traffic demand. I think, you talked about Southeast Asia. Yes, Southeast Asia, it is a very dynamic region, that holds a lot of promise in terms of a growth story, right? But, when we compare it against India, when we compare it against China, the contribution to global air traffic demand is not as large as those two. So, it still remains an important part of the conversation, but, the contribution, will be much less when compared to, the two twin engines of growth. But, Southeast Asia, I think, we did mention that in 2023, it only recovered to about 80% of its pre-pandemic seat capacity. But, I think it is projected to be able to return to that 2019 level this year. And I think, if we look further ahead, once it reaches, this sort of pre-pandemic level, the growth story is promising. If we look at the region, positives to take away is that, there's a very strong macroeconomic growth that's been projected for all many of the developing markets in this region, right? You have a growing middle class, you have rapid urbanization, you have a lot of these countries, put a lot of emphasis on developing the tourism sectors, and that really, helps to drive and contribute to air traffic demand. I think primarily we also see, improving intra-regional connectivity that is occurring between these different countries to cater to this growth in air traffic demand. And also, I think we see a very significant increase and significant growth in e-commerce demand, which then contributes to a lot of this cargo, a lot of this freight demand that we'll see in the region. So China and India still the twin engines of growth, but we see Southeast Asia certainly as a promising region, a smaller region, but a promising region that will obviously contribute to the overall Asia Pacific air traffic growth in the future.
Sticking with Southeast Asia, I mean, it's interesting. I was reading a story just a day or two ago. I think it was on Bloomberg or something like that. Thailand has been talking about visa-free travel within ASEAN. And a lot of people said, well, it's a great idea, but it would have to be, the visa would have to be for 90 days, not 30 days, if people really wanted to take advantage of that. And ASEAN, I've lived in Asia long enough. ASEAN is not really known for its region-wide agreements. I mean, there's a lot of bilateral agreements within ASEAN, and a lot of people complain that it's more of a talk shop than anything. Do you think something like that, an ASEAN-wide visa, would ever come into play?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting article. I think I saw the same article that you read, right? I think what they're looking at is trying to develop this joint visa program, trying to create, I guess, a similar Schengen type visa that we see in the EU. I think with something like 6 different other countries. I think it's an interesting proposal. I think what we see in the past, I would say 12 to 18 months, I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have, recognized that there's been a bit of inertia in bringing back tourists to their respective countries. And each of them have launched, a whole slew of bilateral visa-free initiatives with India, with China, just try and jumpstart the tourism sector after the pandemic. I think it's definitely, trying to create a multilateral, 6-way agreement. Obviously it's a lot more challenging, than having multiple bilateral agreements. There are a lot more considerations, there are a lot more interest to be aligned, so it's definitely going to be much more challenging than trying to forge multiple bilateral deals. So I think, what we probably definitely will see, at least in the near term, I think bilateral agreements will still be, part of, still be quite common. Region-wide multilateral agreements, it'll probably take a lot longer to be negotiated. But certainly, I think, we will see a push, in just having all these mutual agreements to really benefit, both parties or even the region as a whole, really as a means to drive tourism, to make tourism a key engine of growth, in many of these Southeast Asian countries.
In the white paper, you also talked about geopolitics. Russian airspace is closed to a lot of countries, not just the U.S., but others. You've got China and the U.S. at odds over different things. So we've got those challenges, and I'm going to add in this other question that I had. There's other challenges like fuel costs, lending rates, the U.S. dollars. Let's talk about the challenges of the region before we take a break.
Sure. So I think let's tackle the point on geopolitics, right? I think you're right. The closure of Russian airspace, has affected a lot of airlines, particularly those that fly sort of the Trans-Pacific, as well as the Asia-Europe type of operations. Airlines or airlines of which who can't really use Russian airspace anymore. They've been forced to reroute, just to avoid Russian airspace entirely. And I think it was Finnair that estimated that leads to a 10 to 40% increase in length of flying, through this route. So what it means is that you're going to have additional costs. Additional costs means higher prices. Higher prices means less demand. And as a result, I think we see some of these airlines having to reduce their flight schedules as a result of some of these geopolitical events. China and US, I think it's the big topic. The very close strategic competition between the two. I think we've seen that has sort of had some impact on aviation, right? I think one of the interesting things is, despite some of the tensions that have been going on, I think recently both US and China have sort of agreed to make it a priority to restore flights between the two countries back to pre-pandemic levels. I think we're not there yet in terms of the capacity, but I think that's primarily a function of a lack of demand recovery, to support this increase in capacity. But if we look past of the passenger side of the business, I think this strategic competition, this geopolitical considerations, one of the ways it has manifested in aviation is through this thing called the China plus one approach in terms of supply chain strategy, right? I think through the pandemic and through some of these geopolitical tensions and issues that have happened, a few years back, a lot of companies have started to recognize the need to move parts of the supply chain outside of China to diversify some of the risks to disruptions that may happen if, for example, China closes up, or, if there is some sort of additional heightened tension between the two countries. So what that means is you actually see, supply chains moving out of China and, coming into India, coming into Southeast Asia. And, this is actually a good thing for aviation, because what you then need then is more flights, for cargo to be shipped between these different destinations, which will benefit the cargo sector in the aviation sector more. So, I think that's how generally I think we see geopolitical events impacting aviation. I think your second question was about challenges in the region. Obviously the usual things of higher fuel costs, higher financing costs, strength of the US dollar. I think those are macroeconomic challenges that, obviously a lot of airlines in Asia are facing. But I think one of the more critical issues as well is the issue of shortages, resource shortages, not only in manpower, I think which we've heard quite frequently over the past, I would say 24 months, but also in aircraft, right? So let's talk about sort of manpower shortages, right? Manpower shortages, I think, not only in airlines, but also in airports. I think we see a struggle by operators to, get enough people to run their operations. And what that means is that it takes either a longer time to get things done. So aircraft turnarounds might take a little bit longer, or it might be a case where, airlines are constrained in launching new flights from a particular airport, just because the airport is unable to handle the additional flight demand or additional flight capacity that's being added. I think on the other hand, the big question today is also about the shortage of aircraft, right? I think through the pandemic, a lot of airlines have retired the aircraft and, reduced their fleet size to tide over the pandemic. But now, demand has come back in force. We are almost at the pre-pandemic levels in terms of both capacity and demand. But the thing is, aircraft that have been retired, they're not coming back.
Right. Alan,
yes.
hold that thought a minute, because I want to talk about this in a little more detail after the break. And sure. Right now, let's talk about that after the break. And we're going to take a break real quick to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. And we'll be right back after this.
All right.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
back. We're talking with Alan Lim. He's the director at Alton Aviation Consultancy in Singapore. Always got to get the consultancy in there. Alan, I didn't mean to interrupt you before the break, but we were talking about challenges, and it was about aircraft shortages. Order books are full up, but also let's talk about Boeing a little bit, because Boeing has been slowed down because of safety reasons, because of production issues and things like that. They can't deliver as many narrow bodies, the 737 MAXs, for instance, because of what the FAA is looking at and all of that, which affects a lot of the LCCs and regional carriers as well. Whenever I fly between Cambodia and Singapore, it's always on a MAX. It's a MAX-8, I think, the last time I always check. But let's pick back up on the shortage of aircraft that you were talking about before the break.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So yeah, I think, the shortage of aircraft, that is, I think, the primary problem, in the industry at the moment, right? So I think we talked about how, you've retired your aircraft, so, you need new aircraft that are coming in. And as you correctly mentioned, I think Boeing's, Boeing is, I guess, has a different set of issues. But if we first talk about, the OEMs in particular, I think many of them are struggling to ramp up production back to pre-pandemic levels and really get production back on track. I think easily you see backlogs for narrow body aircraft, right? I think if you place an order now, the earliest you can get, either an A320 or MAX, it's probably the early to mid part of the next decade. And if you're talking about wide bodies, it's probably, the later part of this decade. So it's a fairly long wait for new aircraft. And, I think what Boeing, the issues that Boeing is facing has made this issue, or make this challenge a bit more intense, a bit more serious. I think, I read a report a couple of days ago that, while, the FAA has told Boeing to cap their MAX production at about 38 a month, I think, with some of the additional checks that they're placing on the production line at the moment, that number, the actual monthly production number has probably gone down quite significantly. So, with airlines, what has this mean for them, right? So I think the key part is airlines are then a bit constrained. They have their growth plans, they see demand coming back and they want to launch additional flights. But without the additional aircraft, their hands are a bit tight in that regard. So I think what we've seen is that airlines have started to do a few things. One is, some of the older aircraft that they may own or lease, they'll still try and hang on to them a little bit longer. But they've also taken to go into the secondary market, right, to look for other aircraft that may be available for lease, to support their growth plans, in order to be able to at least execute on the strategies that they've put in place right after COVID. But of course, this is not a full solution. I think we have seen airlines that have been forced to either rationalize their networks. They've cut the economically non-viable routes, or even some of the economically viable routes, but maybe not as high up in their prioritization list or their priority list in terms of where they should fly to. I think some of the LCCs have been, more, they've felt the effects a bit more acutely in that regard. Obviously, I think with demand coming back, they've really wanted to put a lot more capacity. They wanted to put a lot more new routes into the market. So, with this shortage of aircraft and also the shortage of manpower, I think a lot of them have felt this, this impact their growth strategies.
While we're talking about manufacturers and OEMs, I'm going to skip ahead on my list of questions here, and then we're going to go back to infrastructure. But you mentioned COMAC, and I saw the 919 at the Singapore Air Show when I was in Singapore back in February. Do you honestly think that COMAC is ever going to be a real competitor with Boeing or Airbus? I mean, I see Embraer maybe stepping up a little bit more as real competition. But COMAC, I mean, half the 919 is Western components. I mean, it's Honeywell, avionics, and so on and so forth. So is COMAC ever really going to be a competitor?
Yeah, I think that was the question on everyone's minds during the Singapore Air Show. I think, there is a camp that thinks that, given the challenges that Airbus and Boeing are facing now in actually delivering aircraft, right? There is a certain conversation to be had on whether COMAC can actually plug this gap, right? Are they a viable competitor? And I think both the executives of Airbus and Boeing have kind of weighed in on this issue. But I think from our perspective is, you're right in that, while they have, quite some orders in their order book at the moment, these are predominantly with Chinese airlines and lessors. And, to be able to, start competing with Airbus and Boeing, one of the key things that they need to do is to get certified, with the FAA, with EASA, in order to get a bit more broader acceptance, outside of, Chinese operators and lessors. I think, what we will see happening, at least in the short term, is that it's a lot of airlines are just seeing, how the COMAC performs, with its current Chinese operators at the moment, right? A lot of people are unsure yet, or they don't know enough to be able to evaluate, the program itself. So, I think if we want COMAC, or in order for us to see COMAC actually challenging and maybe even displacing orders from Boeing or Airbus, I think they need to, number one, as I said, get certified. Number two, I think very importantly, need to demonstrate their service performance, their reliability with some of these customers. I think only then, will other airlines actually sit up and take notice of COMAC and the C919. But, before that happens, I think, as you mentioned, it's probably it's still a bit early days to say that they will actually can compete with Airbus and Boeing. I think, it's a case where people are starting to just consider and see what that's about. But until there's more concrete, performance data, reliability data on the aircraft, there will be still some ways to go, before they can be a third entrant in this duopoly of Boeing and Airbus.
Okay, great. The report, we talked about airports, which are not my favorite part of the aviation experience. I've had problems with automation recently, which I've written about at airports. But anyway, infrastructure, people are building new airports. Where I live here in Cambodia, they just opened a new one in Siem Reap when you go see the temples. It's had some teething problems. Transportation to and from the airport is not as smooth as it could be. Facilities within the airport are probably not as good as they could be. They're building a new one outside the capital of Phnom Penh. What other countries are focused on? India, I think, is trying to upscale some of their regional airports. Give us an idea of what the infrastructure, how the building is going and what's going on with that.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that, the one country we can't ignore is India, right? I think India, if you look at sort of the penetration of airports compared to its population, I think it's far below some of the developed markets in obviously the US and even China, right? So I think, through the efforts of the Indian government and various sort of private companies, I think India has built something like 75 airports in the past decade. And they're looking, I think the total count of airports in India is currently about 150. And they're looking to expand, this number to about 220 in the next 5 to 7 years to, support that growth story, which I spoke about earlier. So I think, there's a lot of, within Asia Pacific itself, I think there are a lot of countries which are really scaling up on developing their airport infrastructure to really cope with this projected growth in demand of air traffic in Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific, in our forecast, is slated to grow the fastest among all the other regions in the world in terms of air traffic demand. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, you've got a growing population, rising economic growth, growing middle class. I think these are all very strong contributory factors, to this market. So I think there are industry estimates saying that there's about 400 plus new airport projects around the world, and more than a third of them are actually located in Asia Pacific. I think you correctly mentioned a few airport developments in Cambodia, but I think if we look around Southeast Asia, you have Bangkok. If we talk about greenfield airports, right, you've got Bangkok's Utapao Airport. You've got Manila's new Bulacan Airport, on top of the NAIA modernization that went out recently. I think Jakarta, you got a new capital airport coming out, and I think in Ho Chi Minh City, I think we have the new Long Tan Airport as well. So all the neighbors, in Southeast Asia, all very, very busy with building new airports. But on the other hand, I think we talk about brownfield airport expansion projects. That's still going on, right? Bangkok, Suvarnabhumi, it's looking to expand the capacity of the airport. Changi, Singapore has its T5. We talked about Manila previously. All these are all the different activities that are going on. It's a very dynamic environment in Southeast Asia, and I think we're going to see a lot more of these projects coming in. I would say next 5, 10, even 15 years to really support this growth in Asia Pacific.
Yeah, Changi's still my favorite airport in the world, but I have my problems with the automation that's always going on. Let's move on to another subject, and we're running a little bit short on time, so this will be my next to the last question. Advanced air mobility, urban air mobility. I wish we all could decide on an acronym so that we'd have to quit writing different things. AAM, UAM, flying taxis, whatever. To me, I mean, I have my doubts. I know you've got Volocopter, you've got EHang, you've got Joby, you've got Wizz Air, you've got all these different companies. Embraer's invested a fortune in it. EHang has invested billions of dollars. I think the figure I saw was $6 billion has already been invested in the industry. To me, it seems like a solution in search of a problem. Helicopters, they seem to do a fine job, and they're not going to be going away anytime soon. Do you think advanced air mobility, if we'll stick with that acronym, AAM, is that going to be a reality as soon as people think?
Yeah, I think with AAM, there are a few angles to consider, right? I think you're right in that helicopters, they work just fine, and it's not going to be fully replaced with AAM. But I think with AAM, the 3 angles that are coming in, right? One is that topic on sustainability. How do you meet our net zero ambitions? AAM aims to create this new class of aircraft powered by new propulsion technologies, electric, hybrid electric, hydrogen electric even. And the aim is being to be able to replace fossil fuel powered aircraft, and starting with sort of smaller aircraft, like your helicopters, your business aviation aircraft, before you move on to sort of the larger aircraft. With sort of electric engines, there is that benefit of a lower operational cost, theoretically. And what that means is, you reduce the cost of operations and hopefully be able to reduce prices and open up a new form of transportation, to a whole set of different users, right? We talk about also unlocking new use cases. I think with AAM, the idea is that, yes, you can replace some of the current helicopters or aircraft. They're performing, your tourism, oil and gas shuttles, but also, they can potentially open up new markets where you can start operating a bit more closely within the urban environment. So you start thinking about airport shuttles across, some of the congested transportation networks that we see, that's commonplace in cities around Southeast Asia. I think, to your question on whether it will become a reality, I think our belief is that it will become a reality. The question only is at what scale, right? I think, there are obviously some reports out there which, paint a very rosy and optimistic picture that, we will end up having, a Jetsons type, air taxi environment in the future. But I think, if we look at the developments today, from a technology perspective, from what the different OEMs are doing, I think we will probably see some limited operations in the next 2 years on a very limited set of use cases. And we'll sort of see that gradually expand, across the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason for this, I guess, assessment, it really comes from the fact that there are a lot of hurdles that still have to be overcome, from a production perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, right? Not only the sort of vertiport infrastructure that you need to have on the ground, but also how do you coordinate all this, a much higher number of these aircraft that are happening in the air. All these are different hurdles to overcome. And I think more importantly, but also, it's about how do you overcome the social acceptance hurdle, right? How does the man on the street, get used to seeing these new class of vehicles, just flying overhead or, flying very close to residential areas where, this is not something that we've traditionally seen today. So again, a lot of hurdles to overcome. But I think, there is that push to make it a reality. And I think some of the largest operators in the world have already started to sit up and, take notice and take interest in this sector. I think Bristol, the world's largest helicopter operator, have already started to place some letters of intent, for these AAM aircraft, and hopefully, in the next few years, we'll see some of them take off literally and be integrated into current operations and hopefully open up new areas of growth.
Well, I like the fact that you use the Jetsons as a cultural reference there. A lot of people don't remember. I mean, I'm old enough that I used to watch the Jetsons all the time as one of my favorite cartoons. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Alan, I always like to end these conversations on a good note. What are the bright spots out there in the aviation industry we can look forward to, say, in the next 6 months, next year?
Yeah. I think the bright spot and the key bright spot that we see is that, I think we are now on the path of growth, right? We've gone past the pandemic. Industry is almost back to, to 2019 levels. And a lot of clients that we see, they are now a lot more forward focused. What should we do then to position ourselves, for a long-term strategy? There are some near-term headwinds that we might have to be aware of, but I think everyone's very forward-looking, and there's a lot of cautious optimism. Not just in the passenger, but in the cargo space. So I think that's a very bright spot for the industry, given the challenges that we've all faced in the past few years. So we're hoping that this will continue. Obviously, I think we still remain cognizant about some of the looming geopolitical, the looming macroeconomic challenges, but as a whole, it's a very long-term, very forward-focused view from the industry.
Okay, great. Alan Lim, Director at Alton Aviation Consultancy in Singapore. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.